Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this webinar from the Development Studies Association of Australia. My name is Valentina Bau, and today we're gonna have a talk on decolonizing research through arts-based method from Professor Caroline Lenette. But let me give you a little bit of an introduction about myself, about the SAA, our thematic working group, and about Caroline. So I'm, as I said, Valentina Bau. I'm the co-director of the Humanitarian and Development Research Initiative at the University of Western Sydney University. But I am also the convener of the SAA thematic working group on creative approaches and practices in development studies. The Creative Approaches and Practices in Development Studies thematic research working group shares the SAA's commitment to the promotion of critical inquiry and the decolonization and democratization of knowledge through research, engagement, and teaching in development studies. Specifically, we want to integrate and share knowledge of creative methods of engagement along with communities while documenting best practices. We work both with fellow academics and with international and local development professionals and activists with an interest in designing socially engaged initiatives. The aim is to develop and apply strategies inspired by collaborative co-production and expression of creative agency and cultural justice in policymaking and engagement. And if you are a DSAA member and interested in joining this group, please reach out to me. I also would like to start by acknowledging the Gadigal people as the traditional custodians of the land on which I'm speaking from today. I would like to pay my respects to their elders, past and present, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who may be with us today on this call. I recognize their connection to their land, their ongoing cultural practices, and their important contributions to our society. So our speaker, Professor Caroline Lenette. Caroline is a professor of anti-colonial research in the School of Social Sciences at the University of New South Wales and deputy director of the Big Anxiety Research Centre. She's known for her contributions to refugee studies and her scholarship on participatory arts-based methodologies in collaboration with refugee background co-researchers. Her current research explores intergenerational trauma and sociocultural notions of suicidality. Caroline is the author of Arts-Based Methods in Refugee Research, Creating Sanctuary, Participatory Action Research, Ethics and Decolonization, Disrupting the Academy with Lived Experience-Led Knowledge, and is the editor of Anti-Colonial Research Praxis, Methods for Knowledge Justice. Caroline also created the Anti-Colonial Research Library, an online repository that hosts a wide selection of resources on First Nations and majority world research methodologies from around the world. And she will also be telling us more about this today. So with no further ado, I'll hand over to Caroline for her talk on decolonizing research through arts-based methods. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Valentina. Valentina and I have known each other for over 10 years now, and it's so lovely to maintain this connection across time and place, especially because our politics align. So I'm joining you from Bedegal land, stolen and unceded Aboriginal land. So this is the land where I live, work and play. I recognise that this land was taken through violence, and this violence continues to this day. We have examples of this on a weekly basis. I recognise my privileges as a senior academic, and I am part of a system and an institution that contributes and that is complicit to the dispossession of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. So I pay my respects to anyone here who is a First Nations person. We often begin with an acknowledgement of country, but I think especially when we come together to talk about this topic, it's really important to reflect on our complicities and the systems that are advantages to us, but perhaps continue to oppress and marginalise First Nations peoples. I also want to say that we have been witness to over 600 days of a genocide, and we get to come together today to have scholarly discussions. This is not something that's going to be possible for Palestinian people for a very long time. We are really failing a test of our humanity. And if you bring whatever feelings you bring to this session, I acknowledge the feelings you hold as we witness what's going on. I will say I have no patience for anyone who calls themselves progressive, except when it comes to Palestine. So to ground us, I wanted to start with a poem, and it is from this wonderful book, a new book that's called Ritual, a collection of Muslim Australian poetry, edited by Sarah Saleh and Zainab Syed. And I had the immense privilege of hearing this poem read recently at the Sydney Writers' Festival. So the poem is called Swarms by Mohammed Awad. Swarms of people scrambling, ants to grains of sugar. Every convoy is a massacre. Insect trap, swarms. Humanitarian aid and gunfire, classical conditioning, swarms. How many times will I see my people behind the lens of a target? Swarms. The Israeli drone hovers with mercy, the cameraman controlling the shot. Look at all the people I didn't kill today. The death toll rises with the sun. The flower has turned red with your cousin. Is this loaf still edible? Are we the monsters for breaking bloodied bread to survive? So thank you for listening. Before I get started, there are three things I wanted to mention. I've been asked to talk about this topic in a number of fora, and so some of what I will say will be synthesized in a paper to be published in a brand new journal that's called Journal of Creative Research Methods. And the wonderful Helen Kara is the editor-in-chief. So the inaugural double issue will be out later on this year, and so you will see a think piece with some of the messages that I share today in those issues. The second thing is that I have been enrolled many, many moons ago. I was enrolled in a master's in development studies. And what I remember from that time is that there were a lot of buzzwords. There were a lot of good intentions, but there was a very strong white savior narrative. And there was certainly no discussions about decolonisation. So I'm really keen to hear you critique your discipline when we have the Q&A, and to hear what you think the problems with the disciplines are. And I much prefer answering questions than presenting, so please feel free to ask what you think might be relevant to this topic. The third thing is that if you want to be liked, you might not relate to the messages that I have to share in this presentation. So Arundhati Roy said that our job is to be unpopular. So I'm very comfortable with that positioning. But I invite you to think about how you feel about whether you're more interested to be liked or whether you are committed to the disruptive approaches that I'm about to share with you. So let's begin first by deconstructing that expression of decolonising research. So the definition of decolonisation that I use at the bottom of the screen is from Tuck and Yang, and it refers to First Nations struggle for sovereignty and repatriation, or we also say rematriation, of Indigenous land and life. So as you can tell, it's quite a specific definition that's relevant, especially to settler colonial nations like Australia. And so the reason why I use anti-colonial research rather than decolonising research is that research is not research praxis is not necessarily about sovereignty and returning Indigenous land. So for me, referring to anti-colonial research and methodologies is more specific about the intent of my approaches and my praxis. So again, something for you to reflect on in terms of what you think aligns better with what you do in your research. So I find it quite troubling that many researchers, especially researchers who use creative methods, don't feel that anti-colonial research or an anti-colonial agenda is relevant to their work and that it's someone else's problem. But in fact, it's everyone's responsibility. So anti-coloniality is integral to ethical research. A lack of understanding of or outright apathy about the colonial roots of research methods means that we risk reproducing harmful and racist norms, and we are reinforcing rather than disrupting normative frameworks in research. So what's important to note is that research methods in and of themselves are not anti-colonial. So the potential of methods, whichever methods you choose to use, the potential relies on applying methods in a meaningful and ethical way. So another useful definition of anti-coloniality when it comes to research is by Day and Lorden. And they state that anti-colonial research means pushing back against the politics of knowledge subversion by refusing to accept the current norms. So as you can see, there are some quite active terms in those definitions. So practicing in an anti-colonial way cannot be passive. You cannot be a passive bystander or observer. It requires actions, commitments, and it requires that you sometimes put your body on the line. So before we go anywhere near methods, it's really important to understand what kind of research environment we are creating to support the realization of anti-colonial praxis. So who better to do this work than arts-based researchers who already do things differently, who must contend with explaining why we do things differently, and often have to go against the norms to do meaningful and ethical research. So for example, arts-based researchers are very good at challenging academic gatekeeping, especially traditional publication and dissemination channels, to share knowledge directly with partner communities. So what do we aim to do as researchers? We move away from dominant colonial research frameworks. We are able to achieve this through arts-based methods because individuals and communities can authentically engage in research, and they are interested in doing so, usually through participatory methods as well as creative methods that are designed and implemented with care. And I will share the reference later on. So what can we do? We can choose to be disobedient, we can choose to be unfaithful, and we can choose to be disruptive. So these words might evoke different thoughts, feelings, and processes for each and every one of you. But I'll share what they mean to me in my praxis, which I have framed as anti-colonial. So being disobedient is usually associated with a reprimand for bad behavior. And disobedience can also mean repercussions and punishment. And that's something you might already experience if you are doing research differently to the norms. And so repercussions are expected when we are disobedient in our research praxis in the colonial project. So when we are disobedient in our praxis, We practice epistemic disobedience, and this is a term that Walter Mignolo has coined, and we prioritize anti-colonial praxis in contexts where colonial values still reverberate. And I can give you lots of examples about why the academic setting that many of us work in represent precisely the kind of colonial values that we are wanting to, to disobey. So Valentina mentioned the Anti-Colonial Research Library, and I wanted to say a bit more about it because that's one example of how to be disobedient. So I came up with the idea and created the library back in 2023, and I received faculty funding for this work. So it's a repository that contains open access resources and links. There's about 450 at the moment, although I do keep adding as I receive suggestions and as I'm aware of new resources being published. The reason why I started this work is I was coming across really relevant resources on First Nations methodologies, but also majority world methodologies that were scattered across different journals. And I felt that it would be really great to have one starting point, especially for someone who doesn't know anything about anti-colonial research and who would like to begin a search on what kind of resources and what kind of models are out there. Up to now, there's been probably 17,000 or so visitors to the website, which has been quite overwhelming to me, to be honest, that there's been so much interest and recognition that this is a useful resource. The link has also been shared on a number of websites, for example, the Racism It Stops With Me website. So it is gaining traction in many different contexts and across many disciplines. So I will say again that the resources are open access, and it's possible that there are many more relevant resources that are behind paywalls, but obviously part of the reason for focusing on open access is so these resources would be available to anyone, anywhere in the world. I will say that when I curated the resources that were added to the library, I only came across very few that focus specifically on arts-based methods or creative research, but there are some great ones out there. I would really encourage you to log on to the library and do a couple of searches just to see what comes up. But what that means also is that if you are a researcher who uses arts-based methods and you are interested in anti-colonial research, there is huge potential to write about this topic and to publish about it in open access outlets if you can. We do need more resources about the intersections between anti-colonial praxis and creative research and arts-based research. So when I talk about being unfaithful, I am referring to the Eurocentric canon that seems to guide a lot of research methodologies still. So we are deliberately unfaithful to the Eurocentric canon, and we skip the mandated flip and fix line of production of Eurocentric methodological frameworks. And it seems that researchers are still very determined to be faithful to the Eurocentric canon. So being unfaithful in research contexts means deeply reflecting on the unquestioned faithfulness to this established idea of what research involves. And with that, the unquestioned acceptance of dominant research models. These are the ones we were taught to glorify through our own education, or that our supervisors suggested when we moved on to further studies. And these are the ones that continue to appear in many research publications. One of the ways to be unfaithful is through citational justice. So if you think about who you cite on repeat, what would happen if you deliberately moved away from the expectation to cite what we refer as the usual suspects? And instead, you made a conscious effort to prioritize First Nations and majority world scholarship in your work, and especially when discussing First Nations and majority world community issues. So if you're unfamiliar with citational justice, and I should say that this is probably the topic that grates the most researchers who are not interested in anti-colonial praxis at all, and whose work is precisely the kind of work that I criticize. There is an interesting article that was published in Nature, authored by Diana Kwon. So that was back in 2022, and it's called The Rise of Citational Justice. So what this means is that it's really important for us to understand the landscape of our own citational practices and what needs changing. So how do we source different thinkers, different models, etc., and different approaches? Now, when I say be disruptive, it means that we tear down the entire colonial research framework. We destabilize notions of what counts as evidence and who decides. And ultimately, we invite critical discussion and propel action to disrupt systems of oppression. So these are words from a First Nations scholar, Autumn Asher Blackdeer, who is in the United States. And the reference is at the bottom, and I'll talk about this book in a sec. But what I would like to say is that being disruptive is not about taking small steps in the right direction. And I'm following Greta Thunberg's lead here to skip and reject those kinds of phrases. I would really encourage you to rethink your use of words like diversity, equity, and inclusion, because that's not the same as being disruptive. The former might be reinforcing the harmful norms that I talked about, rather than challenging them and ceding space for more First Nations and majority world perspectives. And so if we stick with the taking small steps in the right direction phrases, that will bring about the kind of deep systemic changes that we need to transform research, no matter how creative we are. So one way to be disruptive is through your writing. So I wanted to talk a little bit about my books, and Valentina has kindly named them in her introduction. If you've come across any of these works, you will probably have witnessed how my thinking about anti-colonial praxis has changed over time, even in the terms of the titles that I use for my books, and some of the things that I was kind of shy and not confident to state very explicitly in my earlier writing, that I'm much more able to articulate in more recent writing. So I'll just say very quickly that the first book is probably going to be of most interest to those of you who use creative research methods, because I talk about digital storytelling, photo voice, community music, and participatory video as 4 examples, specifically to refugee research, but obviously can be applied across many disciplines. And then I expanded that scholarship in relation to PAR as a method that's been whitewashed, but is actually grounded in majority world scholarship and principles, and is such a powerful tool in anti-colonial praxis. So I want to say a couple of things about this beautiful book, and you can judge the book by its cover. It is beautiful on the outside, and it is in terms of its content. I will share with you a couple of chapters that are probably most relevant to this book. But I would like to say that this activity of editing this book started as a standard neoliberal undertaking of wanting to write a book that achieved a similar purpose to the Anti-Colonial Library. I wanted to synthesize some up-to-date writing on what anti-colonial praxis means in different contexts. But as I was trying to finalize the edited collection towards the end of 2023, the book actually became a means of survival, and it became a means of bringing people together. in different countries at different stages of their career. And so what we decided to do is to write a collaborative conclusion rather than me writing it by myself. And so we wrote the conclusion with 10 other authors who contributed chapters as a set of 9 provocations for anti-colonial praxis. So what we were struggling with is, what does our work mean in the context where we're watching such colonial violence take place? And so we decided that it would be useful for us to outline and articulate the kinds of values and principles that underpin anti-colonial praxis that makes our work more meaningful and that will hopefully have some kind of repercussions to push back against the harmful and normative frameworks that I referred to earlier. So the chapters that are possibly most relevant, chapter 5, and I've referred to it earlier when I talked about arts-based research and the potential, especially in humanitarian research. Chapter 7 is about arts-based research in relation to sexual and reproductive health and rights in the context of the Philippines. And chapter 9 is an interesting approach of using a story circle interview method to gather narratives and to come up with solutions together. So I hope you do get to peruse it, because it is quite, if I do say so myself, quite a fantastic collection, and it's been so wonderful to work with this amazing lineup of authors. So let me get back to our topic and the importance of setting up the right research framework before we even think about methods. For me, and I have seen this message reiterated in seminars by people like Linda Tuiway-Smith. So hopefully you've come across her wonderful book called Decolonising Methodologies. It is much more important to be able to outline the principles and set the parameters of what anti-colonial research praxis means to you personally, before you are able to know how to apply methods. So how to apply methods, you can find that out through publications and talking with other researchers whose work align with yours. But those methods in and of themselves will not create the change we're after if we are not able to create the right environment for them to be to have potential and to be emancipatory and transformative. So I want you to honestly evaluate the way you engage in your own research right now, and what needs to change and what needs a complete rethink in how you conceptualize research. So let's remember that being a researcher is an immense privilege, and we can no longer afford to validate practices that reinforce colonial and racist structures and hurt people in the process. So if you want to see change in the research landscape, you have to be prepared to give up what you are comfortable with. New ways of doing research often mean abandoning frameworks that you have benefited from or currently benefit from. So that's something I want you to keep thinking about. But before we answer questions, I wanted to give you a bit of a little practical sort of commitment exercise. I wanted you to take a couple of minutes now to jot down, so either on your phone or on your laptop, or if you have a pen and notepad handy, commitments of what you will do. So in what ways will you be disobedient? How will you be unfaithful? And how will you be disruptive through the research methods that you will use? So I'll just be quiet for a minute and let you write down your commitment, and I will be doing the same as well. So hopefully this is something you can hang on to. I've always found it very useful to write down those commitments for when the going gets tough. And believe me, it does get difficult to be practicing in this way. And when I come across the words that I write down, I remember this moment and the reasons why I made those commitments and the reasons why I thought these practices were important and were aligned with my values. So I hope that it will achieve the same outcome for you. And right now, I'm very happy to answer any questions that are in the chat or that will come through Valentina.
Thank you so much, Caroline. This is just a really an absolutely wonderful and insightful talk, and I personally got so much out of it and so
Thank
much
you.
thinking and so much reflecting, with the sort of all the work that I do also in the Global South and the communities that I've worked with. Yeah, I think that sometimes we go in with the best intentions, but when we don't ask ourselves these questions, then we end up falling into, the same old paradigm of colonial research. And I'm sure, myself and other colleagues are guilty of that and are probably thinking right now, yeah, what is our way to be disobedient, unfaithful, and disruptive? So thanks for sort of providing us with the opportunity to reflect on this further. I invite the audience to this live stream to please drop some questions into the chat, and I will share them with Caroline. But to begin with, maybe I wanted to ask you something myself. As you were talking, I was thinking really about this idea of co-research, and really sort of, working together with the research participants, or maybe not so much with just research participants, but really with the communities that we research, to kind of to provide sort of a training and understanding, and really begin to conduct that kind of research together. And I wanted to ask you if you wanted to tell us a little bit about your thinking around core research, and how, not to fall back into those, um, um, sort of consultative, but not so much participatory kind of approaches that sometimes may take place.
Yeah, that's a really beautiful way of framing it, Valentina, that it's actually very easy to do for anyone, including me, to fall into those patterns that we learned without being critical. And I think when you are engaged in co-research, and especially when you're using arts-based methods, if it's easy, probably something is not going well. Usually good research comes off the end of hard work, of messy relationships often because we've had to renegotiate power differentials. Um, it has to be driven by participants and community members. And that's often the exact opposite of what we are able to do as people employed by academic institutions, where we have to write research proposals with every little detail of what will happen, and same with ethics applications, well before we've had a chance to dialogue and to negotiate a sense of ethical relationship and collaborations with community partners. And so for me, the two main values that are essential for this to be done well and not to replicate the dirty history of research and the harmful approaches that we're trying to disrupt are humility and reciprocity. We can't engage in research, and I would hope that it's any form of research, not just participatory, where we think of ourselves as the experts. We have to be able to cede space and create an environment where we have the humility to let go of control and where we are able to listen with intent. So this is a learning from First Nations research, the deep listening, of being able to really put aside our preconceived notions of what works, even though we think we know what works, and to be able to just listen and to listen for a long time and to pinpoint the areas of tensions and the areas of uncomfortableness in terms of what we are receiving, because it is an immense privilege to be receiving from our community partners and co-researchers. And then to be able to decide, well, some things I'm going to have to unlearn and some things I'm going to have to relearn in the company of co-researchers and community partners. So that demands humility. And then we can start talking about the project. So there's a whole heap of work that's relational, that needs to take place well before we even think about our research questions, our methodologies, and our dissemination strategies. But like I said, academic contexts in particular are not conducive to this kind of work. Usually we have to do projects very quickly. We have to deliver on our promises with outcomes and outputs focused. It doesn't mean that the two things can't coexist, and there are absolutely brilliant ways of being able to meet our responsibilities towards researchers towards co-researchers and community partners, as well as our institutions. But it is difficult. And that's what I mean by, if it's too easy, then something might not be working quite well. So the other value of reciprocity is that we are always conscious of how there are benefits to everyone involved. So not just to us as academics who have to worry often about career progression and publications, but also that the outcomes and the processes and the methodologies are meaningful to the people at the center of research, without whom the research does not exist. The people who have the most to lose in terms of being involved and engaged in research, and that we are able to give some of ourselves as well, that we reject the objectivity myth, that's a very sort of positivist value, that say that we should sort of have no feelings involved. It's impossible. If you are working with human beings, there will be feelings, and relationships are wonderful but also difficult to manage. And so being able to bring all of this in the research encounter without feeling ashamed or guilty, or without feeling that we're not doing research well, are hugely important.
Thanks, Caroline. Yeah, it just reminded me of a conversation that I was having with one of the authors of the Hadri working paper series that I edit. And one of the authors brought a working paper on his experience of doing participatory action research in Southeast Asia, and really the depth and the sort of the depth of the discussion and the involvement of research partners and everyone into this process, and the struggle of making the ethics committee understand how this process was evolving without a natural, clear structure that was going
Yes.
A to B to C. So yeah, I think it's as you're saying, it does involve sort of a lot of restructuring also in the structures that we're currently fitting in. And I think what your answer also goes very well with the as a sort of as an introduction to the question that Aidan has posted into the chat. How do you think early career scholars and practitioners can be disobedient, unfaithful, and disruptive while still trying to build their careers?
That is such a great question. Thank you, Aidan. Yes, I can't claim to say that the measures that each and one of us will take will be the same. I have the privilege of an established career and an ongoing position, and I am able to say things now that I couldn't early on in my career, and I didn't know how to in any case. Aidan, I really trust in your capacity to be able to determine this on a daily basis, because those kinds of changes need to happen on a daily basis. It includes things like challenging normative frameworks when you hear your colleagues adopt a particular approach, and you might say, why don't we try to do things a bit differently? And here's a suggestion. It also, if you have the opportunity of supervising HDR students, that's a great way of making sure the next generation of scholars do not repeat the same mistakes as we did. So perhaps in the near future, if you have those kinds of opportunities, even supervising honours or master's students, to be able to really get them to question their own colonial education and how they can implement anti-colonial values in their praxis. It's very hard for me to sort of give you more concrete examples because I don't know your situation or your context. I will say that the reason why I talk about repercussions when you are disobedient is because that is the case. I could share a lot of examples, and a lot of my colleagues who practice in anti-colonial ways as well could give you countless examples of the way that there are repercussions. And so for every action that you commit to, you have to be sure that you are prepared to the eventual repercussions that will come your way, because they will come. When you are in a colonial institution, it is undeniable that you put yourself at risk. And I can see that your question is precisely, how do you avoid that risk? And at some level, that's not possible. And that's why I talk about putting our bodies on the line. So for me personally, as a brown person in a white majority institution, in a white majority country, I put my body on the line because it's not an option. I can't just say, I'm not going to worry about this today because it affects me on a day-to-day basis. And then my praxis will affect a lot of people in very deep and significant ways. And so it's not an option for me not to practice in this way. But I will say, when research takes place in a beautiful, transformative, nourishing way, and you see people flourish, and you see people take their own risks and see the rewards of taking risks because they have challenged and they have disrupted, that's also beautiful. So it's a matter of finding the balance and making decisions that work for you, and don't compromise your well-being to such an extent that you cannot be in this environment anymore.
Thanks, Caroline. We also have a comment slash question from Charles, who, sort of, I agree with the statement that the academic has divided loyalties. So perhaps disobedience in publishing perhaps disobedience could be in publishing in the English language, even though intended consumers may be non-English speakers. What do you think?
Yes, that's a really important point. I mean, there is quite a level of irony, and there's a paradox to be publishing anti-colonial writings and scholarship in English. We know that English is kind of the dominant language in our context in countries like Australia, the US, so North America, Europe, etc. It is difficult to find other ways of sharing this scholarship, although I will say for this publication that I showed you before, I negotiated with the publisher to have some of the abstracts in the author's first language. And so that's published on their website. But the publication itself, because of the publisher, but also because of pragmatic considerations such as copy editing, means that publishers are not set up to necessarily to publish in multiple languages. What we have done for chapter 8, which is authored by one of the authors is a Palestinian author. We have published a photograph of the abstract in their first language so that the words themselves would appear in the book in their first language, if that makes sense. I'm trying to find it very quickly as I'm talking, but if you have a copy of the book, you will be able to find it pretty quickly. So there is a huge paradox there that's not easily resolvable. the reason why I became aware of this is when I was collecting resources for the Anti-Colonial Research Library, some of the abstracts were published in both English and Spanish or English and French. But that was maybe for, I will say, maybe 8 of the resources that I placed in the library out of more than 450. So that's not a lot as well. So one of the things that we can do is to lobby. If you're on a journal, in a journal editorial role, you can lobby with the journal to find ways to publish works, and at least the abstract, in different languages. It does make the work knowable to a wider range of readers, although we are talking about a very structured and established publication industry that's very difficult to challenge. One of the small ways that I've done that is to co-author with co-researchers, but that hasn't resolved the issue of linguistic dominance when we're talking about English.
Thanks, Caroline. I also was thinking about really art-based research method, and maybe if you could comment a little bit more around really this idea of art, how we see art, our interpretation of art, and how it might differ entirely from sort of the approach and the interpretation that other communities, that other people around the world have, and and how does that impact this research process?
Yes, I think in most contexts, so whether it's Western-centric or majority world context, art is often seen as a sort of highbrow activity, part of being cultured. And so there has been barriers in terms of class and socioeconomic backgrounds to even consider art as a tool with potential. But I have been challenged in my own praxis a couple of times. One example was when I was working with a small group of South Sudanese women on a body mapping project. And one of the craft items that we brought were magazines. But I was a bit unsure about the types of magazines that my colleague chose to bring to the workshop, because they were an art gallery kind of catalogue. And I thought, they're not going to relate to this. Like this is too elitist, and it's too it's a different type of art than the ones that I was hoping to encourage in the workshop. But I was proven completely wrong. They took the magazines and they found the most interesting artwork that related to their lived experience of racism, of disability, of marginalization, of discrimination in ways that I could not have imagined. So in that case, I had to sort of undo my own preconceived notion of where art sits in people's experiences. And we also know that art is used in so many contexts where we think, oh, we wouldn't have imagined that communities would be interested in art at this stage, where they're busy surviving, trying to get food, trying to find shelter, trying to find safety for children, etc. But art has this amazing ability to just resonate with people in different contexts and at different points in time. So that's the other consideration that's important, that perhaps at one point in time, it doesn't make sense, it's not interesting, it's not engaging. But over time, and perhaps as people move through different contexts, and I'm thinking here about forced migration, different contexts of being in refugee camp or being in detention, or resettled in a Western nation, art takes new significance. So whether it's through songs or through photographs, or through craft, or making new things to signify new stages in their lives. I never stop being surprised at how people engage with art at different stages of their lives. And so that's a good thing for me personally, because after a few years of doing this, I might think, oh, I think I know what people might be interested in doing, and I'm often proven wrong.
That's great. Thanks, Caroline. We have another question from Anat. You sort of have already addressed a lot of this, but they wanted to here some examples to the questions that you put to the audience and some tips on managing tensions with universities on pursuing those approaches, especially for younger researchers.
Yes, yeah. I think that's really important, and it kind of links back to the previous question about how to evaluate the risk to yourself. I have to say here too, so based on my personal experience, when I've reflected on what I could do, I've often thought, I'm not going to do that. I'm definitely not going to do that. There's too much at stake and it's too big a risk. And then when I have found myself precisely in that situation, I've actually realized the risk is not as big as what I imagined it to be. And even if the risk is still there, the fact that I was able to be true to myself and to be authentic in my engagement has weighed much more in the balance than the risk. So again, I say this from the perspective of someone who has done this for a number of years and who doesn't have the same considerations as perhaps you might be new to academia and you might still be thinking about whether you want this to be your career, or you might be thinking about leaving your job, or you might actually love your job even though you know there are some problematic aspects and you don't want to jeopardize that. And no one will judge you for that. No one will judge you. But what I will say is that you will know when the time is right to speak up. And you will know when there are small or micro opportunities in your everyday interactions, when you can actually do small things. Remember that not every intervention has to be major or institutional. Sometimes it's a conversation with a colleague to say, you know, the kind of authors that you're citing in our collaborative work, I'm sorry, but I can't have those names in a paper with my name on it. They really don't align with the kind of values that I talk about and the kind of values that are important to me and the kind of values that mean that we can practice in ethical ways in our research. So challenging that. Ensuring that even undergrad students understand that when they're citing work in their essays, for example, that they can draw on First Nations scholarship, that they can figure out that not everybody who's pale, male and stale and perhaps dead always has to be the people that they cite in their work. So it can start in small ways. When you are out in the field, it's also about acknowledging that you know that some of those conversations are difficult and uncomfortable. The very fact of acknowledging means that people can bring issues to you. If you choose to ignore the colonial context in which we have to do research, very often that also silences others. And so that's what I mean by you have to weigh the pros and cons of every decision, but the benefits and the sense of alignment and authenticity that you will feel whenever you choose to do something differently that's aligned with anti-colonial praxis weighs more in the balance usually. And then sometimes there are repercussions. So I can give you a brief example. When I talked about citational justice at a previous presentation, many people agreed with what I said, and some didn't, but didn't speak up on the day. But I know of one instance where someone wrote a whole piece about what I said about citational justice. And it's not surprising. It means actually that I'm doing my job. I'm not being popular, but I'm challenging practices in such a way that it forced people to reckon with their own uncomfortableness about what I said and then respond to it. And so you cannot always be prepared for the repercussions that will come your way. But as long as you have a very solid community of similar-minded people around you, so that's one thing I'll say, make sure that it's not a solitary undertaking. Seek advice if you're unsure about what the potential risks are. Find the people who think like you, stick with them, work with them. Say no to opportunities where you know you will be hurt. For example, I don't participate in any undertaking where I'm the token brown person anymore. I used to do that because I thought I can't say no to this opportunity, it will hurt my career. And then when I stopped doing that, even though I missed out on opportunities that I really wanted, but I felt at peace with myself because that was my authentic self that was saying, no, I'm not going to be that person. So if you're able to do this often enough, it will sustain you, it will nourish you, and it will help you determine, what do I want to do next? Where do I go next? This is for the long haul. This is not something that's going to change overnight. And so surrounding yourself with the right people, I think, is pretty crucial.
Thanks, Caroline. We have 5 minutes left, and maybe I'll ask a final question myself. I was thinking about this idea of unfaithfulness, the European canon that you were talking about in your talk. And I was wondering how can we try to be as faithful as we can and really try to give more visibility to the literature that we should actually really start following. And the sort of the repository that you've talked about, that you put together, is an example. Although we still have so much work out there that is behind paywalls, and it is maybe just really hard to find, for many different and often sad reasons.
Yes.
How do you think we can start sort of going about this?
I'll use this book again as an example. Unfortunately, at the moment, it is behind a paywall, but it will go open access in 2028. So even the publishing industry has realized that they have to function differently, because it's not possible to keep knowledge from First Nations scholars and majority world academic behind paywalls, because it means that the canon will never be challenged. It means that we will still have access to one body of literature, but very limited access to the kinds of literatures that we need to cede space for epistemic justice and for citational justice. And so the ways that I try to continue with that commitment is, for example, for this edited book, I only invited First Nations and majority world scholars. And so even though that might seem like, oh, of course that makes sense, because it's about anti-colonial praxis. But actually, when you look at the anti-colonial literature and the decolonial literature, very often the authors who are cited have no lived experience of coloniality. They are outside observers looking in and making statements and building arguments based on other people's experiences. So one of the ways that I'm committed is to continue to develop special issues or edited collections that will always prioritize First Nations and majority world scholarships, and especially from ECRs. And if that means that ECRs have to collaborate with more senior colleagues to be able to develop for a publication, that's absolutely fine. But it's making sure that they are the first authors, so that the copyright and the knowledge is attached to their names. So there are many pathways where we can do that, especially with journals. We can ask, especially journals who claim to talk about ethnicity and all of that, to make some of their articles open access. For some journals to waive the article processing fees for First Nation scholars or majority world authors. So there are a few ways like that where we can think, well, how can we stop the machinery of producing Western-centric knowledge in favor of First Nations and majority world scholarship? And because there is inequity there, and there is disadvantage, there is lack of opportunity, what can we do to reverse that trend? Because there are very practical ways where we can lobby for things to change. And we can ask people like journal editors to be true to their commitments. So all of those things are written in documents about equity, diversity, and inclusion, but in practice there can be very little that's being done. And so we should be the people who observe that and ask them to change those practices.
Thanks, Caroline. These are really great suggestions, and definitely something to keep in mind as we move along with our publishing and academic work. So I think that this brings us to a close of this wonderful talk and discussion on decolonizing research through arts-based methods. Thanks again, Caroline. This was Professor Caroline Lenette from the University of New South Wales. Thank you so much for joining us and for your time. I'm Valentina Bau, the convener of the Creative Approaches and Practices in Development Studies Thematic Research Working Group with the Development Studies Association of Australia. And we would like to thank the SAA also for enabling this live stream, which is now coming to a close. Thank you very much again.
Thank you.